I'll be reading from chapter 7 of Rudolf Steiner's Riddles of Philosophy. This chapter is titled The Classics of World and Life Conception, and it's focused on Schelling and Hegel. A sentence in Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling's Philosophy of Nature strikes us like a flash of lightning, illuminating the past and future path of the evolution of philosophy. It reads, quote, "To philosophize about nature means to create nature," end quote. What had been a deep conviction of Goethe and Schiller, namely that creative imagination must have a share in the creation of a world conception, is monumentally expressed in this sentence. What nature yields voluntarily when we focus our attention on it in observation and perception does not contain its deepest meaning. Man cannot conceive this meaning from without. He must produce it. Schelling was especially gifted for this kind of creation. With him, all spiritual energies tended toward the imagination. His mind was inventive without compare. His imagination did not produce pictures as the artistic imagination does, but rather concepts and ideas. Through this disposition of mind, he was well suited to continue along Fichte's path of thought. Fichte did not have this productive imagination. In his search for truth, he had penetrated as far as to the center of man's soul, the ego. If this center is to become the nucleus for the world conception, then a thinker who holds this view must also be capable of arriving at thoughts whose content are saturated with world and life as he proceeds from the ego as a vantage point. This can only be done by means of the power of imagination, and this power was not at Fichte's disposal. For this reason, he was really limited in his philosophical position all his life to directing attention to the ego and to pointing out that it has to gain a content in its thoughts. He himself had been unable to supply it with such a content, which can be learned clearly from the lectures he gave in 1813 at the University of Berlin on the doctrine of science. Posthumous Works, Volume 1. For those who want to arrive at a world conception, he there demands, quote, "a completely new inner sense organ, which for the ordinary man does not exist at all," end quote. But Fichte does not go beyond this postulate. He fails to develop what such an organ is to perceive. Schelling saw the result of this higher sense in the thoughts that his imagination produced in his soul, and he calls this intellectual imagination. For him, then, who saw a product created by the Spirit in the Spirit's statement about nature, the following question became urgent. How can what springs from the Spirit be the pattern of the law that rules in the real world, holding sway in real nature? With sharp words, Schelling turns against those who believe that we, quote, merely project our ideas into nature because, quote, they have no inkling of what nature is and must be for us, for we are not satisfied to have nature accidentally through the intermediary function of a third element, for instance. We are not satisfied to have nature accidentally correspond to the laws of our spirit. We insist that nature itself necessarily and fundamentally should not only express but realize the laws of our spirit, and that it should not only then be and be called nature if it did just this. It should only then be and be called nature if it did just this. Nature is to be the visible spirit, spirit the invisible nature. At this point, then, at the point of the absolute identity of the Spirit in us and of nature outside us, the problem must be solved as to how a nature outside us, outside ourselves, should be possible. End quote. Nature and spirit, then, are not two different entities at all, but one and the same being in two different forms. The real meaning of Schelling concerning this unity of nature and spirit has rarely been correctly grasped. It is necessary to immerse oneself completely into his mode of conception if one wants to avoid seeing in it nothing but a triviality or an absurdity. To clarify this mode of conception, one can point to a sentence in Schelling's book, On the World Soul, in which he expresses himself on the nature of gravity. Many people find a difficulty in understanding this concept because it implies a so-called action in distance. The sun attracts the earth in spite of the fact that there is nothing between the sun and earth to act as intermediary. One is to think that the sun extends its sphere of activity through space to places where it is not present. Those who live in coarse sensual perceptions see a difficulty in such a thought. How can a body act in a place where it is not? Schelling reverses this thought process. He says, quote, "It is true that a body acts only where it is, but it is just as true that it is only where it acts." End quote. If we see that the sun affects the earth through the force of attraction, then it follows from this fact that it extends its being as far as our earth, and that we have no right to limit its existence exclusively to the place in which it acts through its being visible. The sun transcends the limits where it is visible with its being. Only a part of it can be seen. The other part reveals itself through the attraction. We must also think of the relation of spirit and nature in approximately this manner. The spirit is not merely where it is perceived, it is also where it perceives. Its being extends as far as to the most distant places where objects can still be observed. It embraces and permeates all nature that it knows. When the spirit thinks the law of an external process, this process does not remain outside the spirit. The latter does not merely receive a mirror picture, but extends its essence into a process. The spirit permeates the process, and in finding the law of the process, it is not the spirit in its isolated brain corner that proclaims this law. It is the law of the process that expresses itself. The spirit has moved to the place where the law is active. Without the spirit's attention, the law would also have been active, but it would not have been expressed. When the spirit submerges into the process, as it were, the law is then, in addition to being active in nature, expressed in conceptual form. It is only when the spirit withdraws its attention from nature and contemplates its own being that the impression arises that the spirit exists in separation from nature, in the same way that the sun's existence appears to the eye as being limited within a certain space, when one disregards the fact that it also has its being where it works through attraction. Therefore, if I, within my spirit, cause ideas to arise in which laws of nature are expressed, the two statements, quote, "I produce nature," end quote, and, quote, "nature produces itself within me," end quote, are equally true. Now, there are two possible ways to describe the one being that is spirit and nature at the same time. First, I can point out the natural laws that are at work in reality. Second, I can show how the spirit proceeds to arrive at these laws. In both cases, I am directed by the same object. In the first instance, the law shows me its activity in nature. In the second, the spirit shows me the procedure used to represent the same law in the imagination. In the one case, I am engaged in natural science, in the other, in spiritual science. How these two belong together is described by Schelling in an attractive fashion. Quote, "The necessary trend of all natural science is to proceed from nature toward intelligence. This, and nothing else, is at the bottom of the tendency to bring theory into natural phenomena. The highest perfection of natural science would be the perfect transfiguration of all laws of nature into laws of imagination and thinking. The phenomena, the material element, must completely vanish, and only the laws, the formal element, must remain. This is the reason for the fact that the more the law structure in nature itself emerges as if it were breaking the crust, the more the covering element vanishes. The phenomena themselves become more spiritual and finally disappear. The phenomena of optics are nothing but a geometry, the lines of which are drawn by the light, and this light itself is already of an ambiguous materiality. In the phenomena of magnetism, all material traces have already vanished. Of the phenomena of gravity, which, even according to natural scientists, can only be understood as a direct spiritual effect of action into distance, nothing is left but their law, the application of which is the mechanism of the celestial motions on a large scale. The completed theory of nature would be the one through which the whole of nature would dissolve into intelligence. The inanimate and consciousless products of nature are only unsuccessful attempts of nature to reflect itself, and the so-called dead nature is, in general, an immature intelligence, so that the intelligent character shines through unconsciously in its phenomena. The highest aim of nature, to become completely objective to itself, can be reached by it only through the highest and last reflection, which is man, or more generally speaking, what we call reason, through which nature returns in its own track, and whereby it becomes evident that nature originally is identical with what is known in us as the intelligent and conscious element." End quote. Schelling spun the facts of nature into an artful network of thought in such a fashion that all of its phenomena stood as in an ideal harmonious organism before his creative imagination. He was inspired by the feeling that the ideas that appear in his imagination are also the creative forces of nature's process. Spiritual forces, then, are the basis of nature, and what appears dead and lifeless to our eyes has its origin in the spiritual. In turning our spirit to this, we discover the ideas, the spiritual, in nature. Thus, for man, according to Schelling, the things of nature are manifestations of the spirit. The spirit conceals itself behind these manifestations as behind a cover, so to speak. It shows itself in our own inner life in its right form. In this way, man knows what is spirit, and he is therefore able to find the spirit that is hidden in nature. The manner in which Schelling has nature return as spirit in himself reminds one of what Goethe believes is to be found in the perfect artist. The artist, in Goethe's opinion, proceeds in the production of a work of art as nature does in its creations. Therefore, we should observe in the artist's creation the same process through which everything has come into being that is spread out before man in nature. What nature conceals from the outer eye is presented in perceptible form to man in the process of artistic creation. Nature shows man only the finished works, man must decipher from these works how it proceeded to produce them. He is confronted with the creatures, not with the creator. In the case of the artist, creation and creator are observed at the same time. Schelling wants to penetrate through the products of nature to nature's creative process. He places himself in the position of creative nature and brings it into being within his soul as an artist produces his work of art. What are then, according to Schelling, the thoughts that are contained in his world conception? They are the ideas of the creative spirit of nature. What preceded the things and what created them is what emerges in an individual human spirit as thought. This thought is to its original real existence as a memory picture of an experience is to the experience itself. Thereby, human science becomes, for Schelling, a reminiscence of the spiritual prototypes that were creatively active before the things existed. A divine spirit created the world, and at the end of the process, it also creates men in order to form in their souls as many tools through which the spirit can, in recollection, become aware of its creative activity. Schelling does not feel himself as an individual being at all as he surrenders himself to the contemplation of the world phenomena. He appears to himself as a part, a member of the creative world forces. Not he thinks, but the spirit of the world forces thought in him, forces thinking in him. This spirit contemplates his own creative activity in him. Schelling sees a world creation on a small scale in the production of a work of art, in the thinking contemplation of things. He sees a reminiscence of the world creation on a large scale. In the panorama of the world conception, the very ideas which are the basis of things and have produced them appear in our spirit. Man disregards everything in the world that the senses perceive in it and preserves only what pure thinking provides. In the creation and enjoyment of a work of art, the idea appears intimately permeated with elements that are revealed through the senses. According to Schelling's view, then, nature, art, and world conception, or philosophy, stand in the following relation to one another. Nature presents the finished products. World conception, the productive ideas. Art combines both elements in harmonious interaction. On the one side, artistic activity stands halfway between creative nature, which produces without being aware of the ideas on the basis of which it creates, and on the other, the thinking spirit, which knows these ideas without being able at the same time to create things with their help. Schelling expresses this with the words, quote, "The ideal world of art and the real world of objects are therefore products of one and the same activity. The concurrence of both, the conscious and the unconscious, without consciousness, leads to the real world, with consciousness to the aesthetic world. The objective world is only the more primitive, still unconscious poem of the spirit, the general organon of philosophy, and the philosophy of art is the crowning piece of this entire structure." End quote. The spiritual activities of man, his thinking, contemplation, and his artistic creation appear to Schelling not merely as the separate accomplishments of the individual person, but if they are understood in their highest significance, they are at the same time the achievement of the supreme being, the world spirit. In truly dithyrambic words, Schelling depicts the feeling that emerges in the soul when it becomes aware of the fact that its life is not merely an individual life limited to a point of the universe, but that its activity is one of a general spirituality. When the soul says, quote, "I know, I am aware," end quote, then, in a higher sense, this means that the world spirit remembers its action before the existence of things. When the soul produces a work of art, it means that the world spirit repeats, on a small scale, what that spirit accomplished on a large scale at the creation of all nature. The soul in man is not the principle of individuality then, but that through which he lifts himself above all selfhood, through which he becomes capable of self-sacrifice, of selfless love, and, to crown it all, of the contemplation and knowledge of the essence of things and thereby of art. The soul is no longer occupied with matter, nor is it engaged in any direct intercourse with matter, but it is alone with spirit as the life of things. Even when appearing in the body, the soul is nevertheless free from the body, the consciousness of which, in its most perfect formation, merely hovers like a light dream by which it is not disturbed. The soul is not a quality, nor faculty, nor anything of that kind in particular. The soul does not know, but is knowledge. The soul is not good, but not beautiful in the way that bodies also can be beautiful, but it is beauty itself, goodness itself. That's from Schelling's On the Relation of Fine Arts to Nature. Steiner continues, such a mode of conception is reminiscent of the German mysticism that had a representative in Jakob Boehme, 1575 to 1624. In Munich, where Schelling lived with short interruptions from 1806 to 1842, he enjoyed the stimulating association with Franz Benedict Bader, whose philosophical ideas moved completely in the direction of this older doctrine. This association gave Schelling the occasion to penetrate deeply into the thought world that depended entirely on a point of view at which he had arrived in his own thinking. If one reads the above-quoted passage from the address on the relation of the fine arts to nature, which he gave at the Royal Academy of Science in Munich in 1807, one is reminded of Jakob Boehme's view, quote, "As thou beholdest the depth and the stars and the earth, thou seest thy God, and in the same thou also livest and hast thy being, and the same God ruleth thee also. Thou art created out of this God, and thou livest in him. All thy knowledge also standeth in this God, and when thou diest, thou wilt be buried in this God." End quote. As Schelling's thinking developed, his contemplation of the world turned into the contemplation of God, or theosophy. In 1809, when he published his philosophical inquiries concerning the nature of human freedom and topics pertinent to this question, he had already taken his stand on the basis of such a theosophy. All questions of world conception are now seen by him in a new light. If all things are divine, how can there be evil in the world, since God can only be perfect goodness? If the soul is in God, how can it still follow its selfish interests? If God is and acts within me, how can I then still be called free, as I, in that sense, do not at all act as a self-dependent being? Thus does Schelling attempt to answer these questions through contemplation of God rather than through world contemplation. It would be entirely incongruous to God if a world of beings were created that he would continually have to lead and direct as helpless creatures. God is perfect only if he can create a world that is equal to himself in perfection. A God who can procure only what is less perfect than he, himself, is imperfect himself. Therefore, God has created beings in men who do not need his guidance, but are themselves free and independent as he is. A being that has its origin in another being, does not have to be dependent on its originator, for it is not a contradiction that the Son of Man is also a man. As the I, which is possible only in the whole structure of the organism, has nevertheless an independent life of its own, so also the individual soul is, to be sure, comprised in God, yet not directly activated by him as a part in a machine. God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. How he could find his satisfaction in the most perfect machine is quite unintelligible. No matter in what form one might think the succession of created beings out of God, it can never be a mechanical succession, not a mere causation or production so that the products would not be anything in themselves. Nor could it be an emanation, such that the emanating entity would remain merely a part of the being it sprang from, and therefore would have no being of its own, nothing that would be self-dependent. The sequence of things out of God is a self-revelation of God. God, however, can only become revealed to himself in an element similar to him, in beings that are free and act out of their own initiative, for whose existence there is no ground but God, but who are themselves like God. If God were a God of the dead, and all world phenomena merely like a mechanism, the individual processes of which could be derived from him as their cause and mover, then it would only be necessary to describe God, and everything would be comprehended thereby. Out of God, one would be able to understand all things and their activity, but this is not the case. The divine world has self-dependence. God created it, but it has its own being. Thus, it is indeed divine, but the divine appears in an entity that is independent of God. It appears in a non-divine element. As light is born out of darkness, so the divine world is born out of non-divine existence. And from this non-divine element springs evil, selfishness. God thus has not all beings in his power. He can give them the light, but they themselves emerge from the dark night. They are the sons of this night, and God has no power over whatever is darkness in them. They must work their way through the night into the light. This is their freedom. One can also say that the world is God's creation out of the ungodly. The ungodly, therefore, is the first, and the godly the second. Schelling started out by searching for the ideas in all things, that is to say, by searching for what is divine in them. In this way, the whole world was transformed into a manifestation of God for him. He then had to proceed from God to the ungodly in order to comprehend the imperfect, the evil, the selfish. Now, the whole process of world evolution became a continuous conquest of the ungodly by the godly for him. The individual man has his origin in the ungodly. He works his way out of this element into the divine. This process, from the ungodly to the godly, was originally the dominating element in the world. In antiquity, men surrendered to their natures. They acted naively out of selfishness. The Greek civilization stands on this ground. It was the age in which man lived in harmony with nature, or, as Schiller expresses it in his essay on naive and sentimental poetry, man himself was nature, and therefore did not seek nature. With the rise of Christianity, this state of innocence of humanity vanishes. Mere nature is considered as ungodly, as evil, and is seen as the opposite of the divine, the good. Christ appears to let the light of the divine shine in the darkness of the ungodly. This is the moment when, quote, the earth becomes waste and void for the second time, end quote. The moment of, quote, birth of the higher light of the Spirit, which was from the beginning of the world, but was not comprehended by the darkness that operated by and for itself, and was then still in its concealed and limited manifestation. It appears in order to oppose the personal and spiritual evil, also in personal and human shape, and as mediator, in order to restore again the connection of creation and God on the highest level. For only the personal can heal the personal, and God must become man to enable man to come to God. End quote. Spinozism is a world conception that seeks the ground of all world events in God, and derives all processes according to external necessary laws from this ground, just as the mathematical truths are derived from the axioms. Schelling considers such a world conception insufficient. Like Spinoza, he also believes that all things are in God, but according to his opinion, they are not determined only by quote, the lifelessness of his system, the soullessness of its form, the poverty of its concepts and expressions, the inexorable harshness of its statements that tallies perfectly with its abstract mode of contemplation, end quote. Schelling, therefore, does find Spinoza's, quote, mechanical view of nature, end quote, perfectly consistent. But nature itself does not show us this consistency. All that nature tells us is that it does not exist as a result of a geometric necessity. Therefore, there is in it not clear, pure reason, but personality and spirit. Otherwise, the geometric intellect, which has ruled so long, ought to have penetrated it long ago. Intellect would necessarily have realized its idol of general and eternal laws of nature to a far greater extent, whereas it has every day to acknowledge nature's irrational relation to itself more and more. As man is not merely intellect and reason, but unites still other faculties and forces within himself, so, according to Schelling, is this also the case with the divine supreme being. A God who is clear, pure reason, seems like personified mathematics. A God, however, who cannot proceed according to pure reason with his world creation, but continuously has to struggle against the ungodly, can be regarded as, quote, a holy, personal, living being, end quote. His life has the greatest analogy with the human life. As man attempts to overcome the imperfect within himself, as he strives toward his ideal of perfection, so such a God is conceived as an eternally struggling God, whose activity is the progressive conquest of the ungodly. Schelling compares Spinoza's God to the oldest, quote, oldest pictures of divinities who appeared, the more mysterious, the less individually living features spoke out of them, end quote. Schelling endows his God with more and more individualized traits. He depicts him as a human being when he says, quote, if we consider what is horrible in nature and the spirit world, and how much more a benevolent hand seems to cover it up for us, then we cannot doubt that the deity is reigning over a world of horror, and that God could be called the horrible, the terrible God, not merely figuratively, but literally, end quote. Schelling could no longer look upon a God like this, in the same way in which Spinoza had regarded his God. A God who orders everything according to the laws of reason can also be understood through reason. A personal God, as Schelling conceived him in his later life, is incalculable, for he does not act according to reason alone. In a mathematical problem, we can predetermine the result through mere thinking. With an acting human being, this is not possible. With him, We have to wait and see what action he will decide upon in a given moment. Experience must be added to reason. A pure rational science is, therefore, insufficient for Schelling for a conception of world and God. In the later period of his world conception, he calls all knowledge that is derived from reason a negative knowledge that has to be supplemented by a positive knowledge. Whoever wants to know the living God must not merely depend on the necessary conclusions of reason. He must plunge into the life of God with his whole personal being. He will then experience what no conclusion, no pure reason can give him. The world is not a necessary effort of the divine cause. Try that again. The world is not a necessary effect of the divine cause, but a free action of the personal God. What Schelling believed he had reached, not by the cognitive process of the method of reason, but by intuition as the free, incalculable acts of God. He has presented in his philosophy of revelation and philosophy of mythology. He used the content of these two works as the basis of the lectures he gave at the University of Berlin after he had been called to the Prussian capital by Friedrich Wilhelm IV. They were published only after Schelling's death in 1854. With views of this kind, Schelling shows himself to be the boldest and most courageous of the group of philosophers who were stimulated to develop an idealistic world conception by Kant. Under Kant's influence, the attempt to philosophize about things that transcended thinking and observation was abandoned. One tried to be satisfied with staying within the limits of observation and thinking. Where Kant, however, had concluded from the necessity of such a resignation that no knowledge of transcendent things was possible, the post-Kantians declared that as observation and thinking do not point at a transcendent divine element, rather they are this divine element themselves. Among those who took this position, Schelling was the most forceful. Fichte had taken everything into the ego. Schelling had spread this ego over everything. What he meant to show was not, as Fichte did, that the ego was everything, but that everything was ego. Schelling had the courage to declare not only the ego's content of ideas as divine, but the whole human spirit personality. He not only elevated the human reason into a godly reason, but he made the human life content into the godly personal entity. A world explanation that proceeds from man and thinks of the course of the whole world as having as its ground an entity that directs its course in the same way as man directs his actions, is called anthropomorphism. Anyone who considers events as being dependent on a general world reason explains the world anthropomorphically, for this general world reason is nothing but the human reason made into this general reason. When Goethe says, quote, "Man never understands how anthropomorphic he is," end quote, he has in mind the fact that our simplest statements concerning nature contain hidden anthropomorphisms. When we say a body rolls on because another body pushed it, we form such a conception from our own experience. We push a body and it rolls. But we now see that a ball moves against another ball that thereupon rolls on. When we now see that a ball moves against another ball that thereupon rolls on, we form the conception that the first ball pushed the second, using the analogy of the effect we ourselves exert. Haeckel observes that the anthropomorphic dogma, quote, compares God's creation and rule of the world with the artful creation of an ingenious technician or engineer, or with the government of a wise ruler. God, the Lord, as creator, preserver, and ruler of the world, is, in all his thinking and doing, always conceived as similar to a human being. End quote. Schelling had the courage of the most consistent anthropomorphism. He finally declared man, with all his life content, as divinity, and since a part of this life content is not only the reasonable but the unreasonable as well, he had the possibility of explaining also the unreasonable in the world. To this end, however, he had to supplement the view of reason by another view that does not have its source in thinking. This higher view, according to his opinion, he called positive philosophy. Quote, "It is the free philosophy, in the proper sense of the word. Whoever does not want it may leave it. I put it to the free choice of everybody. I only say that if, for instance, somebody wants to get at the real process of free world creation and so forth, he can have all this only by means of such a positive philosophy. If he is satisfied with a rational philosophy and has no need beyond it, he may continue holding this position, only he must give up his claim to possess with and in a rational philosophy what the latter simply cannot supply because of its very nature, namely, the real God, the real process, and a free relation between God and world." End quote. The negative philosophy, quote, "will remain the preferred philosophy for the school, the positive philosophy that for life. Only if both of them are united will the complete consecration be obtained that can be demanded of philosophy. As is well known in the Eleusinian mysteries, the minor mysteries were distinguished from the major ones, and the former were considered as a prerequisite stage of the latter. The positive philosophy is the necessary consequence of the correctly understood negative one, and thus one may indeed say that in the negative philosophy are celebrated the minor mysteries of philosophy, in the positive philosophy the major ones." End quote. If the inner life is declared to be the divine life, then it appears to be an inconsistency to limit this distinction to a part of this inner life. Schelling is not guilty of this inconsistency. The moment he declared that to explain nature is to create nature, he set the direction for all his life conception. If thinking contemplation of nature is a repetition of nature's creating, then the fundamental character of this creation must also correspond to that of human action. It must be an act of freedom, not one of geometric necessity. We cannot know a free creation through the laws of reason. It must reveal itself through other means. The individual human personality lives and has its being in and through the ground of the world, which is spirit. Nevertheless, man is in possession of his full freedom and self-dependence. Schelling considered this conception as one of the most important in his whole philosophy. Because of it, he thought he could consider his idealistic trend of ideas as a progress from earlier views, since those earlier views thought the individual to be completely determined by the world spirit when they considered it rooted in it, and thereby robbed it of its freedom and self-dependence. For until the discovery of idealism, the real concept of freedom was lacking in all systems, in that of Leibniz as well as in that of Spinoza. A freedom that many of us had conceived and even boasted of because of the vivid inner experience it touched on, namely, one that is to consist merely in the domination of the intelligent principle over the forces of sensuality and desire. Such a freedom could be derived from Spinoza's presupposition, not merely as a last resort, but with clarity and the greatest of ease. A man who had only this kind of freedom in mind, and who, with the aid of thoughts that had been borrowed from Spinozism, attempted a reconciliation of the religious consciousness with a thoughtful world contemplation of theology and philosophy, was Schelling's contemporary, his name Friedrich Daniel Ernest Schleiermacher, who lived from 1768 to 1834. But I'm going to stop there and let you digest what Steiner had to say about Schelling.